My name is David Harrison. I used to be recently retired clerk of the International Development Committee in the House of Commons and spent a lot of time travelling around the world's cities. One of the most striking things, of course, is the appalling gridlock that affects cities from Dar es Salaam to Kathmandu. And it's something that clearly can't continue. One can't build one's way out of it. One can't address the problem of the increasing car use in this way. And to go down to specifics, I just wondered about the opportunities for sustainable transport in the form of cycling and walking. I mean, I noticed in Yangon that in the previous military regime, cycling had been banned, and the only person who cycled was the head of DFID in the city. Really, what can be done about this? I see the UN has made statements about cycling. Is there a role for donors? Is there any chance to move to cities that are fit for cycling and walking, where the future is perhaps like Copenhagen, as it ticks so many boxes: health, inclusion, sustainability, climate change? And also I wondered whether, as the ODI continued its work in projecting progress, you might include in Chapter 3 access to sustainable transport. Thank you.
Okay, we'll come to that. Thank you. Let me take the gentleman just in the row in front of you, David. You could introduce yourself first.
Thank you. My name is Fidel Mpela. I used to be a student at UCL. My question is related to Paulo's concern, in the sense that one of the criticisms about the new urban agenda is that from the UN Habitat's perspective, it's the UN Habitat trying to fight for its survival, so it's encroaching on the territory of other UN organizations. So my question is, so if you read the urban agenda, you see a lot of clashing sentiments. You're trying to follow an economic logic for development, but at the same time you want equality and so on and so on. Mm. My question is, where does this leave cities, especially those of the global south, who have to implement basically conflicting ideologies?
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for that very pointed question. Let me take one more from the lady here.
Hi, thank you. Claire Cummings, I'm a researcher here at ADI. A question partly for Billy and also for the Mayor of Tema. Billy, you mentioned that unlocking finance for cities is one of the key challenges which we face. And I wonder if you can think of countries where you have examples of national government really enabling and empowering cities to have more access to finance and be more empowered fiscally and financially to deliver their objectives at the city level. And Mayor of Tema, if it's still online, could you maybe comment on how you work with national government to try and gain more access to finance and have more financial independence and autonomy, and perhaps comment on the challenges in that? Does it feel like a bit of a competition, a kind of something which you really have to lobby hard with to national government to get that support, or is it something which you find you feel really like you work in partnership?
Great, thank you. So if I can go to Mayor Adamton first. Hang on, just need a... Should we go to someone else first? Can I just come back just to make sure you've got a question? So the first one on gridlock and sustainable transport and cycling, is that an agenda that you're working on? What are the prospects for that in Tema? And secondly, the question about financing. You talked about financing, but do you see it as a competition? And I'd like to add another, abusing my chair's privilege again. You know, if donors are trying to get finance to you, how should they best do it? I mean, donors will understand national sovereignty. They should be giving to the government. Money should be going to the national programs, to the national government. What's the best modality for them being able to finance you?
All right. Thank you. I'll try and address in one question as posed. The one that has to do with transportation and more about local people in terms of cycling and then how mobility is enhanced within the city is currently ongoing. We have the Greater Accra Bus Rapid Transit, which Tema is part of it. It has already been launched by the President of the Republic, President John Dramani Mahama. And so transportation is already key. But what Tema is doing specific is to reduce the ASIL on our route for haulage trucks from the port to the main corridor outside Tema by supporting a private investor to develop a real corridor from the port of Tema to the industrial free zones area. And that would do a lot of good by reducing the haulage trucks on our routes and freeing the routes for residents and buses to to be able to implement the bus rapid transit. Again, on the issue of financing, currently the law does not empower or give room for the district assemblies to access funds directly. What we can do now is just about a little about $500 as an assembly, and that certainly cannot be said to be a financing regime. But what is the case is, at the time, as Billy alluded to, if the structures at the local level are do not have their capacities built, they will take on a lot of financing, they will take on a lot of bonds and credit, and these would crystallize into national bills. And so carefully, the local decentralized systems were not empowered. But currently, whilst we go, there is a legal regime under discussion for the municipal assemblies, the assemblies with capacity to generate revenue, to go onto the market and float municipal bond. It's far advanced, and I'm sure by Q1 in 2017, we'll be talking about implementation. But to add to that, government has opened a special desk at the Ministry of Finance where public-private partnership initiatives are encouraged. And out of that initiative, TEMA has already in the pipeline a $600 million project, which we are going to finance through a PPP arrangement at the high level. At this level, 15 projects are receiving attention at the ministry, and that is the kind of collaboration we have. So any of the projects we have targeted could have donors willingly stepping in to deal with central government, but for specific local assembly intervention. So it should be possible for any donor or investor to approach TEMA and make a choice of whichever project they want to undertake. We would get them through the Ministry of Finance and through central government to ensure, so long as the project is economically and commercially viable, government is always willing to assist, even if it is a facility, to assist, because we can borrow on our own balance sheet and on the strength of the cash flow of the selected projects. And so even though the legal regime does not enable us currently to borrow, there are a lot of programs government has fashioned which is supporting through the public-private partnerships at the upper level, and even at the local level, we take advantage of that. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for that. Billy, let me put Fidel's question to you, which is basically, new urban agenda, is it UN territory building, empire building? I'm paraphrasing you, but that's kind of the question, wasn't it? Well, and the sustainable transport question as well.
Let me start with the sustainable transport, because I think it's a critical question, but can I just rephrase it? Because transport is one of the most obvious sectors, but there's a whole range of perverse policy decisions that are being taken. Let me put a general proposition to you. Despite what they say, most governments and most local governments are anti-poor in practice, if not by speech. In fact, what they implement has perverse consequences at the city level. And so it's not always meant, but then you have to look at actually what gets implemented. So we can take transport as one of them. Access to land, which directly relates to transport, would be associated to that. So we have a plethora of short-term decisions that have been taken, which are in the interests of the current elite in given cities, which effectively push settlement patterns out in a massively inefficient manner. And the consequence, of course, of that then is on urban mobility. Then you have to look at where the subsidies go and who gets subsidized. And the golden rule in most cities, and I promise you it's as true in London as elsewhere, is normally the poor subsidize the rich when you look at actually the flow of funds. This goes back to research we did years ago in South Africa when we looked at the relationship between Soweto and Johannesburg. And until we have open data which shows really where decisions of the financial consequences both to the fiscus that year, but also long-term for the city, is the kind of thinking that we need to change about. So transport is one of the best ones. If you go, my most vivid one was, of course, is visiting Dhaka in Bangladesh, which is an absolute nightmare in transport terms. And most policies are written for the absolute minority of people who have cars. So that's what transport policy in Bangladesh is for. An elite of, I think the percentage was 11% of the population in Dhaka, don't quote me on that, was private car driven, and all policies were aimed in that way. You turn that around, as the mayor has done previously, Enrique Peñalosa and elsewhere in Bogota, to try and democratize the city through pedestrianizing access to public transport and bicycles, and it's a different city. Those are and this is absolutely not a debate for the global south. This is a universal debate, but it's not a transport issue. My point is, it's also a transport issue. It's about rethinking the city and where we are making conscious or unconscious choices to put in large amounts of public money. What are the long-term consequences of that? Most decisions that have been taken are perverse and are in favor of a minority rather than the long-term sustainability of the city. And that's transport, it's land, it's services, it's access to all of the benefits of a city. That's what needs rethinking and is not being rethought. And that is London as well as Tema, as well as the 5th largest city, or in Bobo Dioulasso in Burkina Faso. Same movie, same story, same battle. On the UN Habitat, I mean, what Fidel relates to is the fact that in the New York negotiations after Surabaya, the last and most controversial stumbling block to the new urban agenda was resolution on the future of UN Habitat in the text. In my own view, it was never appropriate to have the future of a UN agency inserted in a substantive document which is meant to be guiding us for achieving much, much wider goals. I think the new Secretary General will have his work cut out. This is a much larger question, which is about making the UN fit for purpose. Less and less, I think, we'll see funds going through the UN to achieve. The mayor from Tema is most probably going to attract all of his investment entirely on his own balance sheet and not with UN assistance. And I think more and more we're going to see cities and national governments. So the role of UN agencies, in my mind, needs to be particularly more clear on setting normative standards and less on being the proxy implementers standing in, because particularly if they end up in a competitive environment. So there's no space in international development assistance for UN agencies to be competing over turf. And really that's for the UN to get its house in order. I'll leave it at that generic statement.
Great, thank you. Paola, there was a specific question about transport indicators, but did you want to speak to any of these other issues? I'm wondering, you might want to talk a little bit about kind of motivations for the new urban agenda. Is that something, or the financing question?
Yeah. So I guess on access to transport, another part of the report, what we did is actually look for 3 cities, examples of already available data for some indicators, particularly within Goal 11, or the city's goal. And I think transport is one where we found that you have information on number of trips, for example, but data on the quality of the transport and where those, the distance from public transport access points, so much more nuanced data on the quality of the access to transport is much harder to come by. So I think that's something that definitely we would like to incorporate, and we think it's really important to look at, but we face data constraints at the time of actually incorporating it to the study. And I think I like Billy's point about making the transport about, it's a wider point about, for example, how people move to work. And I think another great example is Medellin with a metro cable, where people living in the outskirts of the cities and on the hills, where the solution for transport in that case was to actually create a metro cable, so to connect people to work, and that makes a huge difference. So just thinking about transport in that way as well. I mean, I think on the SDGs and the global agenda, UN politics and so on, I'm not sure I've got much more to add here. I think, for me, I see it as the SDGs and climate as the roadmap, and those are the aspirations, those are the targets. And then it's about local implementation. So that's how I would phrase it. And I think just briefly on the financing point, the other thing that I would add is, again, some of these issues go back to capacity of developing bankable projects, particularly infrastructure projects. So going back to that kind of key point that we've been discussing about.
Which, again, you've talked about this being a universal agenda. I mean, we've seen in the US having shovel-ready projects is a massive issue there as well. This isn't just a developing country issue. This is a universal issue. Thank you. Let me take some more questions. There's a hand at the back. Thank you.
Thanks to all three of you for your presentations. It's Gareth Wall from the Commonwealth Local Government Forum. I wanted to just follow up a little bit. Billy mentioned the democratisation of the process of some of this development activity, particularly whether it's through transport or otherwise. Do you find these agendas likely to support greater democratisation at the local level, or the reverse? It's explicitly missing in the SDGs, and I don't know too much on the urban agenda, but certainly yourselves, as you've looked into it, and yourself, Isaac, how do you feel these agendas help with the localisation of the SDGs and the democratisation? Thanks.
Great question. Thank you. The woman at the front here, please.
Hi, Alex Landé from Adam Smith International. So there is an increasing recognition of the role of local governments and municipalities to monitor and manage the informal economy. I wanted to know what are the best examples you have from your experience of countries where this has been done successfully, where local governments have been provided with the right means, capacity, and resources to do this properly.
Great. I think the richness and the variety of the questions, I think, is just indicative of what a big agenda it is. I'm gonna take one of the questions online. Actually, I'll come back to you next round, but I don't want to leave out people who are watching this online. So, Amanda Cave at the One Campaign is asking, in what ways do you think mayors in developed countries can work with those in developing countries to achieve the SDGs? I think that's an interesting question to come to. Mayor, I'm going to come to you first again. So. I think all of these are for you, really. Yep. Informal economy, democratisation question, and then, what relationship do you have, if any, with mayors in developed countries, and how does that help you? How could that be improved?
Okay, thank you. Maybe to take it from the last bit, there is the Covenant of Mayors of Sub-Saharan African, which is also a global covenant, which we are a part of. I think it's a new platform. I think the exchanges that will be coming out of that platform would not only be expertise sharing, but it will also give us the strength to consolidate the things that we are doing, which other big cities and developed cities have already gone through, so we don't reinvent the wheel. We find that platform very good. There's also the Mayors for Peace, which the Hiroshima mayor of Japan is the president. We think that mayors must also speak to some of these issues. But
so sorry, just to be specific, for you, it's a kind of an information sharing relationship. That's what you're most looking for.
Beyond the information, practicalizing what has worked elsewhere and what could be adopted, but what could be adapted, not just ignoring the specific needs of cities across the different continents. We understand that the global agendas are the goals. I mean, they are the overarching outlook for us, but we ought to contextualize, we ought to localize, and we also have to look at the specific situation in which we find ourselves. But one of the questions that came up is how the SDGs are shaping what we do, how we localize in this. And I think that the story of Ghana must probably be told louder now. I am very confident. It looks to me that the story, the narratives have been the same. And I would say that then we are suffering from the prejudiced box. We are still being kept in that prejudiced box. Because, look, You look at even on hunger, how I do share the same sentiments with Billy when he says that policies are anti-poor, or policies and subsidies are supporting. Yes, because if we continue the way we are going, then the poor will not be helped to come up. But look at Ghana specific. We started school feeding, for example, to deal with hunger and also improve health and well-being. And in the school feeding, over the past 8 years, we have moved from about 440 school children being fed with one nutritious meal to 1,700,000 school children. And for me, that is remarkable. Under LEAP, the Livelihood Empowerment Against Poverty, which is a program which for us in developing country, no one will think about such a thing. But I think the narratives about Ghana must begin to change, because LEAP again has registered over 1.7 million people and given support tied to even health insurance, tied to transportation. Recently in Tema, we launched over 500 aged who are given a special card which will give them access to public transport. And so these are strong pro-poor, pro-marginalized sector of our economy that we are deliberately touching and making sure their lives are bettered. I can give you examples. For now, besides every region, the 10 regions in Ghana, every region has a regional hospital, but we are still focused on CHIPS compound, which has mini clinics within the communities. And the president has ensured that every assembly makes a commitment to providing these health centers within the communities. And so this is how we're pushing the agenda. I believe that with time we'll be able to
interrupt. Can I ask you just on Gareth's question about democratization? Can you speak to that specifically? So it sounds like some of these programs you were already implementing them. How's it affecting your sort of local relationships within the governance sphere?
Okay, I'll say two things on this. There is a bit that is centered within the decentralized system already. And there is the other bit, which is a reinforcement from central government. For example, we have shifted from activity-based budgeting, even not looking at output-based, to outcome-based. And when you deal with outcome-based, which is a structured document that all the assemblies are supposed to follow, what we are saying is that do the things that will reflect on the sustainable development goals. To the extent that the templates that are coming to the assemblies, I also happen to be the president of the local association. And so we are broadening the involvement of the locals through the budgeting process itself. And so the templates would say all your activities must relate to a certain outcome you want to achieve. And the outcomes could be the goal of the goal of the SDGs as we have. And so whatever you are touching would have its ramification on other activities. And that is how strong our decentralization and encouraging local participation can be.
That's very specific. Thank you. Thank you for that. Paola, let me come to you. Again, I think any of these questions could relate to you. I wonder if there's something, the informal economy, if that's something that you've looked at, or I think it'd be interesting to hear your reflections on the democracy question as well.
Yeah. I think on that, I was thinking there are some references, I think, in the New Urban Agenda in terms of some of the mechanism, making an emphasis on democratization and participation, and some of the instruments that actual modalities that can help with that, from participatory budgeting to more participatory planning in the actual development of city plans. So I think there is a mention there.
And to push you on this, a mention, but any discussion on actual follow-up or implementation or specifics?
Again, this kind of goes back to the point that I was making before. These are aspirations, and governments have signed up to them. Now the question of the follow-up and implementation is up to each different place, really. So there isn't, at least for now, there isn't a follow-up on those sort of issues, which isn't to say that there might be one later on, but not at the moment. There are no indicators or ways of following up on those promises.
Great. Okay. Billy.
Well, at its most simple level, the basic proposition is the following, that at every city level, you want all affected, interested stakeholders to be involved in decision-making, however structured, about the future, about your common future in that city. So, in our experience, this tends to come, one of the biggest threats to this is the absence of useful data at a city level. Most mayors are driving blind. They don't know how big their city is, who's in it, where they came from. And so we have been supporting through UCLGA, of which the mayor is through NALAG a member, and through slum dweller organizations, funding Know Your City campaigns where you generate the data and then it is shared to build a common understanding. But if you can formalize this without over-formalizing it, in the sense in Uganda, we have supported the emergence of municipal development fora at every secondary city, and now the government, and so these are regular monthly meetings between the local authority, the slum dwellers, and ideally the local private sector to discuss really tangible local government, classic local government issues. These have now been formalized, or in the process of being formalized and legislated for by the government, so they become structural statutory bodies. I hope the formalization doesn't kill them. But the intent is very, very clear, which is that you do have ways of bringing in, then you've got local accountability. What's missing is not just so much data as open data. We really need to, if we want to be transformative in this, I think the call for open government and the mechanisms of open data are going to be transformative. They could even work in this country.
Can I just comment on that? I think when we were doing this assessment of Goal 11 and looking through 3 examples of city, what kind of data available we found, sometimes we did find the data, but it took a long time to get there, and we're researchers kind of looking for this information. So I think one of the recommendations actually was we need to be better at communicating and being open at this about this information. So if this is something that the SDGs can help us to achieve, that would be great.
Yeah. And the informal economy?
In many cities, this is the economy.
Right.
And so it's. I think we need to get over this distinction and rather rethink the city and work out how do we strengthen all aspects of the economy. But the biggest creator of jobs, and they may not be long-term sustainable jobs, but at the moment they are essential jobs in most African cities and subcontinent in Asia, are what are called informal. But if 70% of your city is informal, you don't have an informality problem. That's your city.
Yes.
Don't get confused.
Yeah. Very, very good point. I promised the gentleman over here a question. I think this might have to be the last one for this round. I'm sorry for other people who've got their hands up, but there is going to be lunch afterwards. The speakers are saying, so I hope we'll have time for more discussion over lunch. But
thank you. My name is Juan from Colombia, and I would like to ask you, we have seen that cities are now the main actor of economic regional growth. However, they belong to a broad city system in which a big agglomeration is interdependent with less developed cities. So my question is, how can we incentivize a positive relation between the developed cities to the region they belong to? Because sometimes, usually most of the cases, these objectives of the cities and the regions go to opposite directions.
Another very interesting question. Let me come to Paola. Do you want to say something on that first?
I think it's a challenging. It's a challenging question, really. So, can I just make sure that I understood correctly? So, you're talking about cities which, in a particular country, in a region, cities that have different levels of development, and how do you prioritize, or how do you make sure that the ones that are growing are also...
This is a question with a particular twist in Colombia.
Do you have particular cities in mind?
Let's just wait. Sorry for the mic. I think the microphone's left the room.
The microphone left the room.
Ben, would you mind just wait? Right, it's coming. We'll come back. If this is specific to Colombia, let's make understand.
It's not
understand
only
the context.
But there is a
Let's hear the
particular
Colombian twist.
debate.
It's not specifically to Colombia, but it can be, like, usually cities belongs to a broad city system. So there is a relation between the developed city in a region with the other less developed cities. So my point is that usually the goals of the region are in opposite direction to the goals of the city. So for example, in London, the objectives of London growth are opposite if you think as a region. This thing can happen also in Colombia if you think the objectives of Bogota are different than the agglomeration that surrounds Bogota or the nearest city that are interdependent with Bogota.
Yes. I guess it depends on governance structures, where where decisions are made in terms of, the city and then the region. And to what extent you also think that potentially investing more on the city that is actually the one that's growing the most would also give you taxes that you can then redistribute to other places that are not doing that well. So it's difficult to answer in abstract, and I can see where there could be instances where there might be trade-offs and actually competition between places, so it's not that straightforward and that might be difficult to resolve. But at the same time, I think there is something about competitive cities and agglomeration economies and making sure that those places that have a economic potential, that potential is fulfilled, and then that you use some of that revenue to increase the potential of other places as well.
Right. Billy.
This is. I was on the platform with the mayor of Medellin in Bogota, so I got to understand the specifics. I mean, this is an ongoing, permanent discussion, which I would summarize abstractly as the mismatch sometimes between jurisdiction and the functionality. And so sometimes you've got municipal jurisdiction, but the functional, wider, often metropolitan area requires a different level of governance. And so the question then becomes, how do you equalize, how do you retain municipal identity where it really, really matters, while still making sure that the system as a whole operates at a different functional level? There are multiple answers to that question. Most of them are driven by a mixture of politics before they're driven by the functionality. And this is a wonderful old movie. I mean, the mayor of Medellin was there, and of course Medellin is a very specific example. But the other mayor who was part of that discussion was from a small town in the Ruhr Valley. And that is 150 kilometers of agglomeration, which has to have a system of cooperation, which makes the entire system work better without undermining local democracy. It'll never be solved. There are different solutions to this kind of battle.
Okay. So, as I say, let's continue the questions and answers over lunch. I'm sorry, Mayor, that you can't join us for lunch. If you have a comment on how Tema sits within the wider agglomeration of Accra, if you have an answer to that question, please do add it briefly, but very briefly. I wanted to ask each of you, I don't want to sum up, but I want to hear from each of you. I mean, you've all mentioned capacity building. I mean, that's a very nebulous term. You've talked about this being a long-term agenda as well. What is the next thing that you want to happen in Tema, that you want to happen, Billy, in the cities you're working in, and Paula? What's the next thing that you think needs to happen in terms of that capacity building? What's the one specific thing that needs to happen next? If you could be as concrete as possible, as we have 1 minute left for the event.
Okay. Indeed, if we have to go far, it is important that we go together with our citizens and the people we seek to serve. But there is also the agency. And usually, if you want to go urgently, if you want to go fast, you've got to sometimes balance the inertia from the masses. And that is where implementation gets challenged. Land issues for development sometimes create a very difficult situation where you think that spatial planning should go a certain direction, but the locals may also have their take. I will leave this as the major issue for which our future outlook will be addressing this as we try to regenerate Tema, transform Tema, and make it efficient, sufficient, and affordable.
Great. Thank you for that. Billy?
Ghana has an integrated civil service, which is very different, so that there's not a big difference between local and national government conditions. The most important thing is to change the relationship between national and local government. So not one is...
And what's the first thing you're going to do to achieve that?
There's not one event. It's just demonstrating what's possible by examples around the world. But as long as one... so that they are seen as complementary rather than competing, and national government isn't quote-unquote better and superior to local government, which is the dominant thought at this point in time.
I'll go back to data, actually. As we were saying before, many of these cities are running blind, particularly when it comes to within city inequalities as well. We would have loved to do much more on this for the report, and we found it very difficult. So I think improving the data available and data capacity would be great. Great.
Okay, on that note, I'll bring the event to a close. I want to thank the speakers, particularly Mayor Adamton for joining us online, the speakers in the room, everyone who's joined us online as well, and everyone who's in the room. Thank you so much. I think it's been a really interesting conversation, and please join us for lunch.